Welcome to the Tanz im August podcast. This podcast series is part of the Tanz im August Festival, presented by HAU Hebbel am Ufer. This year, it takes place from 15th to the 31st of August in 9 locations in Berlin. Several artists from this year's program have been invited to participate in a conversation. Each episode seeks to offer insights into their creative process, uncovering what's behind the decisions they made and the knowledge they gained along the way. The artists tell listeners about their current and past projects, revealing detailed information about the work that will be presented during Tanz im August. In this episode, Ricardo Carmona, artistic director of the festival, talks with Yinka Esi Graves. She will present her new work, The Disappearing Act, on 24th and 25th of August at HAU.
Hello, Yinka. Very nice to have you with you in this episode of the podcast. I would like to ask you to introduce yourself for the people that don't know you.
So my name is Yinka Esi Graves. I'm a British dance artist, and I'd say the form that I most work with is flamenco. I always have reticence to say that I'm a bailaora necessarily, because I understand that my interest kind of crosses into other forms of kind of coming to the body and expressing from the body. But traditional flamenco is like a source that I'm constantly in conversation with.
If you go back to your memory, what was the first moment that you connect with dance and how you felt that this could be a path for you also, that you wanted to become a dancer and a choreographer? Do you remember this moment?
So, you know what's funny? I feel like dance has always been present in my life. So from when I was really young, my parents tell me that they noticed. So I was about 3 years old. We lived in Nicaragua in Central America. And we went to this carnival in Managua, which is on like the Caribbean side. We lived on the Pacific side. And this was a Caribbean carnival, so it was mostly Afro-descendants. And apparently I came home and kind of did all the dances that I had seen. Kind of like, oh, they did this and then these people did that. And since then, my parents were like, okay, we need to put this child in a dance class. But funnily enough, I think I battled until I was much older, until finding flamenco, with even accepting that I wanted to dance professionally. So even though dance was always present, I did ballet when I was young, I did Senegalese dancing, I did jazz modern, and then I did capoeira at one point. Like my body has always wanted to engage with movement and expression. In fact, when I went to Cuba on my gap year, so I was 17, 18 years old, and I was kind of on my way to university to study history of art. In Cuba, I went with like my camera because I was really interested in film, and I was like making this kind of documentary. But I ended up dancing with this Afro-Cuban dance troupe called Yinka Esi. And I think to me that really describes my relationship until I'd say about maybe 10 years ago, where the body was always just leading and saying, well, we're doing this. And my head had this kind of very like, I went to a French lycée, you have this job in the arts kind of thing. So I was thinking I was doing one thing, and I feel like my body that has won the battle, if there was one, was really the one pushing me to. And that's kind of with flamenco, the same thing. It was a sensation that was internal. And I would say that it's only through the very discovery that's happened with flamenco, with me understanding its roots, which I'm sure we'll speak more about, even the thought that I could be what we call a choreographer arose. It was never something that I saw from the outside and was like, oh, I want to do that. It's more through the experiences of dancing flamenco, through the things that I've come to learn through doing it, that the desire to create work around that has arisen.
Yeah, I think when one imagines or thinks about flamenco, one doesn't really immediately connect it to contemporary dance. It's much more about this form, about the tradition. But you, and also together with other people, I feel that you are also opening new paths and exploiting the form of flamenco in a very interesting way. And I also feel there's a lot of freedom in the way that you and other people are doing this. How has been your experience in this kind of, let's say, transition from like the more traditional classes from flamenco and then to make a contemporary dance piece?
I like that you say classes, because I feel like that's where potentially the way flamenco is educated nowadays, where there's a sense of rigidity that's kind of setting flamenco as one thing. Because I really like to think, and, influenced by people like Pedro G. Romero, who is a kind of artist and thinker who's worked with Israel Galvan, for example, for many years, and is kind of maybe like the brainchild of this ability to kind of open the references within the genre. But he always reminds us that in its very beginnings, flamenco was always avant-garde to a certain extent, Some of the first images of dance on film are flamenco. You have Carmencita, dancers like Argentinita who've influenced other forms, buto, or have inspired different art forms, be it painting and so on and so forth. So I think there's always something about the immediacy and the contemporariness of flamenco that's actually in its inception. But alongside, there's always been this desire to sort of frame it in this like national context of how rigid it could be. And I suppose what one buys into in that sense maybe then defines what one thinks one's doing. And I say that to kind of put out the sense that in a way, what this recent journey for me has been like, okay, how do we connect with values in flamenco that actually have to do with freedom, that have to do with like this desire to respond to, musical form through an energetic response in the body. Sometimes I think that's ultimately what flamenco is so powerful in doing. And so what shape that takes, what aesthetic that takes, maybe isn't what has to be central. Maybe that's where the freedom can come from. And I think for me, that's been very liberating. And in a sense, I think it allows me, but obviously like the greats like Israel Galvan, Rocío Molina, Andrés Marín, who are the kind of the big names, but there's so many other artists who are maybe just being honest and we're speaking about their truth in the form. And as opposed to having to play with this idea of disguise that is still there in flamenco, of like trying to represent something from yesteryear. I feel like the form itself actually has space for each person to express themselves in terms of where they are.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's very insightful. You just mentioned a while ago about this reference to the roots of flamenco, and I know that this is something that you also investigate in the last years. Can you share a bit with us?
It's funny because obviously now we talk a lot about like embodied knowledge. We talk about the body as a space that, and especially in the context of like the global South, in the context of marginalized people, in the context of like indigenous peoples, African descendants, the African diaspora. And I did not have a clue when I started dancing flamenco that in fact, what I now understand drew me in its very physicality, in the doing of it, is this like forgotten, hidden reality of Spain and Portugal, these two territories in Europe, almost having been the first like European Afro, like holders of the African diaspora in Europe, talking between the 14th and 19th century, post the Moorish period. That's like a separate thing in terms of thinking of like flamenco as a modern form that's born in the 19th century, drawing from the kind of the modern Spanish history post Andalusi, Moorish Spain. And so this is something that I think has been like nagging inside my body as I was doing flamenco. And it wasn't actually until I moved to Seville. And for that, I thank La Lupi, who's this incredible dancer from Malaga, who I first saw online, as we often do, on YouTube. And there was something in her physicality that I was like, oh, hold on a minute, wait a minute. I need to go and study with this person. And I was very lucky because I caught her just before she exploded, because she started dancing with Miguel Poveda, who's this big singer, and going on tour with him. So she stopped her regular classes, but I was able to spend, it was just 1 month, but like intensively with her. And she was so generous. We like have lunch together. She was just amazing. And in that time, I realized that one of her great influences were Rianero dancers who are from Seville. They're like the old Gitano community, the Roma community, who to me still have this vestige of an African presence in them. So without knowing it at the time, there was something in La Lupi's expressivity in her body that was making homage to this older generation of flamencos who themselves almost still held something of this African presence. And so, but at this time, I wasn't aware of this. I was just kind of enjoying the experience. But I understood that I needed to move from Madrid, which is where I'd been for about 5 years. That was like my introduction. I knew I had to come to Andalusia. I knew that Andalusia in the classes there was singing, and just flamenco is just much more present in everyday life. Then one of those things, I was here 3 months into me being in Seville. I'm called to work on this film called Gurumbe Canciones de tu Memoria Negra. And I'm coming face to face with Miguel Ángel Rosales, who's the director of the film, and all the people that he's bringing into the film, the researchers, the academics who have been looking at for decades in the archives, in the parochial archives, in all the sort of the registers that exist of the period of like Latin American colonization, and then bringing out the fact that, and I didn't know this, the fact that cities like Seville, where I just moved to, cities like Cadiz, cities like Jerez, these cities that were so important in flamenco, but obviously also important in the modern Spanish kind of boom post the arrival and everything that ensues in the Americas, and the wealth that is gained through the exploitation of the peoples and the land, that we have up to 15% of the population of African descent. So this myth that we have that, people were taken from Africa to the Americas has totally excluded the fact that people were also brought to Spain and Portugal. Now, when I find this out, it's like, sorry, what? How? What are you saying to me? And so this marrying of something that's been drawn internally on a body level with this kind of historical fact that's completely erased from people's memory, or even the history books that are taught, let's say, here, just unleashes a sense of like, okay, so maybe I'm not crazy, because I think up until then, I'd always just had this sense, and from this kind of shared understanding that it's like, what is this Black woman doing here in class trying to learn flamenco? Like, we all had this sense of it being something a little bit odd. But suddenly I'm like, so maybe it's not that strange. So many things have happened since then. One in making me then be even more interested in like, so this is incredible. This forgotten community sort of is still speaking to us through flamenco though, because this is a form that obviously I have to say this because I think people often get scared and they think you're completely removing the importance of the Roma community, who are the great porters of this form, of course. But it's just asking for us to be more complex about how forms are created. That this is a time when Spain was global. This is a time when we have the coming together of Roma community with obviously the Spanish culture, the Andaluz culture of the time, the Moorish presence that was here for over 800 years, and the Jewish presence. All of that left a mark in terms of the musical and popular imaginary and culture, to which we just have to add another kind of root that's just cut out, which is the African descendants, in the way that it's impossible to speak about modern American popular culture or culture in terms of music and dance without recognizing the African descendants. Like Latin America, you cannot speak about Latin American music and dance without speaking about its African descendants. And really, you cannot speak about flamenco without also speaking about that. And so it's simply, and I think it's beautiful. It's like, it's expanding Miguel Ángel often talks about this, expanding the space with which we understand the African diaspora, and kind of reaffirming that despite the despicable positioning in society of African descendants, despite the attempt to erase continuously, physically, literally physically, and ideologically, there is this persistence for whoever wants to see it, And so for me, that is beautifully empowering. It's helped me so much continue, because the form is very difficult. This doesn't mean there are fewer hours in the studio. It doesn't mean anything except make me feel stronger in my desire to do this as well as I can, considering I came so late, And so this is why sometimes I'm like, maybe I'm not even a dancer. Maybe I'm just somebody who's like doing this excavation work through the body, because I have not had the trajectory, let's say, of what we usually consider a dancer to a certain extent. But it's a beautiful experience. And I suppose that's why I was so interested in invisibility, in this work, The Disappearing Act. It's like, I think that has just been something that has been like accompanying me, the invisible, in this ongoing journey, let's say.
Yes, really beautiful way that you describe this. And I mean, you've been talking also about this erasure that happened also in this kind of construction of this history of flamenco. And the piece that we're going to present here in Berlin is called The Disappearing Act. So I'm assuming that there's totally a connection there. Do you want to also to speak how you brought this to the studio, how you started to develop the piece, and what was the inspirations then to make the choreography?
Yeah, so I think The Disappearing Act is like the culmination of all of these recent sort of thinkings and experiences. And absolutely, I think I'm speaking about flamenco, but I suppose maybe flamenco is just a mirror to so many other ways in which African descendants have been treated and are thought of throughout the world, let's say, and especially in the West. So erasure, I think, is part of that, and this inability to see fully when, if it's not erasure and invisibility, it's like hypervisibility, but there's this reluctance to see this sort of three-dimensional, rich, full sort of sense of people of African descent. And so it felt like, okay, maybe this is actually something physical to work with. And so what became clear was that because here I'm sort of trying to make a work around really a sensation that to me has happened in spaces. So I always talk about the Puente de San Telmo, which is kind of where everything that I was explaining before is kind of crystallized. So this is a bridge that crosses the Guadalquivir River, which is so important in terms of this, the wealth coming into the country, but also the actual like merchandise, people's gold, so on and so forth. And so this is a bridge that separates us from Triana and the city of Sevilla, let's say, even though they're both the same. And as I crossed this bridge for many years going to classes, I always had this sense there was something in the water. There was something dragging me down into the water. And I just had this kind of sentence that was like, oh, I have people in the water. I don't know why, but that was just like something that I sensed. And it was years later that I found out that bridge is where the port used to be, El Puerto de las Indias. And this is the port where all of this merchandise and so on, all people were brought. Very, very recently, I'm talking like maybe 6 months ago or something, I went on a Black Seville tour and I was told exactly where enslaved people were disembarked from the ships coming from West Africa and where they were cleaned in this front house opposite before they were taken over the other side to be sold at the cathedral. And then, so this barrio of Triana, so thinking back to what I was saying about La Lupi, which has always been known as a historical Roma gypsy community, turns out that was also where a lot of African descendants, because it was outside the city, is also where a lot of African descendants lived. So it's just incredible that in that space, in me crossing that space, I had this sensation, which I then later learn has this very real history. And so it made me think like, maybe I need to go to historical spaces. Maybe I need to really converse with those spaces and deal with this sense of knowing that's internal, yet this sense of not knowing in what I'm presented, right? Because there's no plaque there to tell us what this was. And that's kind of where the work starts. So we did these kind of improvisations. So the Puente was the first place that we went to. But now we've got a series of 6 films, which I did in collaboration with Miguel Angel. So Miguel Angel from Gurumbe Cantones de Memoria Negra is also now my husband. I mean, it's all a bit crazy, but it's the truth. But what's really lovely, and for me in The Disappearing Act, is like actually for us to film these improvisations as an archive, that intimacy was very necessary. That lens of somebody watching with an understanding of what the implications are historically, but also emotionally, I think was very important. So I also wanted to be able to bring this conversation back to the African continent. My mother's from Ghana, and it's maybe of no coincidence that my mother and her family are actually from Cape Coast, which is where you have some of the most important forts where enslaved people were kept before they were then shipped over to the world, be it the Americas or here Spain, as I reimagine that. So we went to Ghana, we went to Cape Coast, and we have 2 films of me working between the 2 castles, which are Elmina and Cape Coast. One responding to the sea, thinking through, and in fact at the time I didn't know this, but afterwards Christina Sharp has helped me frame all of that and thinking about this idea of residence time, the idea of the present still in, the past still in the present of all the peoples who are still in the Atlantic with us. She uses this biological term of residence time, which is really about sodium, about how long it takes for matter to sort of dilute and disappear in the water, in the sea. And apparently sodium, which is obviously in our blood, takes 260 million years to dissolve. So it's this really powerful sense that it's like, yes, they are still there. So one of the pieces is looking at the sea, and we were always filming at like 6 a.m. And I mean, it was incredible. There was like an Ewe settlement. So Ewe are probably the nation in Ghana who are still living in the most traditional way, let's say, both culturally, but also even their houses, these beautiful, like woven sort of plant houses. And when we were doing these improvisations, I'd return to the same place. And at that time, it was like there were so many things happening, like people were doing these acts by the sea. It was really incredible. So that is all kind of coming into my experience as well. Even though that's not in the frame, I feel like there's this interesting communion happening. Then we also, in Spain, we filmed on the bridge, but I also felt it necessary to think beyond the actual act of removing people from their homes. So there was a sense of looking to marooning. I'm half Jamaican as well. The maroons of Jamaica are obviously very important. The forest is very important as a site of it trying to escape. And then I was later invited by Pedro G. Romero in Portugal to go into conversation with the spaces that had once taken part in the colonial expositions of 1934. And so there we have 2 other films. So all of that became material for me to then work with in the studio to sort of think about invisibility as like these sites remain there. How much healing has happened around them? Potentially none. And they're still charged in a sense with this history. So this question of it not being visible, but it's still sort of hanging there with us. And that's where the vocabulary, which I suppose isn't very flamenco in the work, even though I'm constantly thinking through these spaces with a flamenco style in mind. So when I come to the actual choreographic work for the piece, for the stage piece, I'm now kind of reinserting fandangos, trillas, tanguillos. Tanguillos is an interesting style because it is very Caribbean in a sense. It's really tanguillos de Cádiz, which is where you have the longest presence of African descendants into the 19th century. And it's this style that's kind of, it's 4x4, it's 3x4. It's as if they all exist in one. And I thought that was interesting to explore. So the very first third of the piece is all tanguillos. It's kind of incessant reminding of that. And then the caña for me, which was what I used when I was thinking through the forest, which is the end of the show, which has become the end of the show, is that space of searching for a way out. And because the caña was like, it's serrano, it's based in the forest, it's based in the mountains, and often has this sense of like the bandolero, those like Robin Hood characters used to go and steal and then give it back. So I thought that was an interesting way of kind of making that having that dialogue.
Yeah, amazing. This was quite a journey. So how much time was there between the filming of these short films and then you making a decision to make the work for stage?
So yeah, the funny thing is that through this whole kind of the beginning of my desire to make The Disappearing Act, we had COVID and I became a mother. So there's a lot of time. When COVID was 2020, we just filmed in Ghana in February 2020. I think we just got back just before everything was shut down. And I remember I was meant to take part in LDIF, and we were able to, because everything was closed and it was like we can only work at home. That's actually how we were able to use the films, because they were just going to be an archive for me in the work. And so that's how they became a thing of themselves, because it was like, oh, well, I can't work on this. We couldn't go in Spain. The lockdown was so severe. We couldn't go to the studio. It was like, you couldn't go out. So that was like a wonderful way of kind of allowing it to still breathe, let's say. But we didn't premiere the piece until 2023 in Nîmes, despite having done a first version. But I was pregnant. I was 6 months pregnant. And it was like I wasn't physically in shape to be able to do what I wanted to do. So there was a long time of kind of the work really crystallizing as a stage piece, but it kind of enabled me to kind of do different things around it, which is why I suppose it has all this baggage, because I had the time. Now I can only dream for my next work to have that kind of space and time, because I think ultimately that's also is great, because I feel like I found a way of working that I really like. So I feel that I was kind of blessed, despite obviously, the terrible reality of COVID, to have that space.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I think also when we see the piece, you feel that the piece is like, it has weight, it has a density about all this research, about all this time that you thought about these topics, totally. And also we feel this in the body also. It's quite special. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that.
During the piece, you mentioned the name of another person as Miss Lala. Can you share a bit with us also who is this person and what is the role in the piece?
Lala, absolutely. So I kind of like flamencoize her. So there's a painting by Edgar Degas called Miss Lala dans le siècle Fernando, which is of this real acrobat who existed. She's called Olga Brown, but she was named Miss Lala in like the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And she was like a big deal in the French, like Parisian circus scene. And she had this trick, which was to like hang from like a big ring from her teeth, and sometimes had like bodies hanging from her. And so Edgar Degas depicts her in this painting. And this painting I found fascinating because you can only see her body. You can't see her face because she's hanging. And I sort of felt, I was like, wow, maybe in this painting, all of the things that I'm explaining, this kind of hypervisibility, invisibility is taking place. And also this sense of, I always wondered, I was like, what would just a portrait of Olga Brown look like where you could actually see her face? There's a sense of like black bodies always being either like, because it's grotesque or it's something, it's like hyper something, it's valuable. But when it isn't, when it's just normal soul, a face, it maybe has no interest, no? And so I kind of have used the idea of Miss Lala almost as being like, because, this work isn't really about me, it's about us. It's about a question that goes beyond me. And so I felt that maybe Miss Lala could be all of us. Maybe Miss Lala is kind of a sense of her in the painting, is this place where I can become all of us, or this can be beyond me. And so I'm speaking French. I felt it necessary. Well, I went to French school, so I do speak French. And I just felt like, because this question, there's flamenco, and then Remy speaks English in the work, and Remy Graves, who's my sibling and drummer in the work, and Rosalia Algeciras is singing in Spanish. And so I felt like this is a question about colonialism beyond just Spain. So I felt like I wanted to also have French there. So I'm borrowing and I'm reimagining Miss Lala, but also because like the acrobat, in a way, in this exploration of invisibility, what I'm really looking at is like agency. I'm trying to see how have Black women, how have Black peoples worked, shape-shifted, camouflaged, played with, pushed against all of that, all of the invisibility, and lived our lives, because our lives are full despite that. And so the acrobat felt like a great place to start, like, okay, that back bending, that hanging from your teeth, to then go into so from the circus to the magician almost, the conjurer, find a way out. That's our chalk. I mean, I'm giving a lot of information, but this is just what I'm feeling, and then people can read it however they want. Obviously, that was a great place to start for me, is this kind of this acrobat. So thank you, Olga Brown. And in a way, just a reminder of these people that have existed. Like, I never knew that there were, obviously we know of Chocolat now. It's like, and I relate this to Jacinto Padilla. So the very first film of a flamenco cuadro from 1900, which was actually filmed in Paris, is of a dancer who's called Jacinto Padilla, and he's a Black man. And that's like, sorry, what? And so again, it's almost like it's a speech to that little moment of like, we didn't know, but they were, because we're always told we're the first ones. Oh, it's never been, it's not true. It's never been, and it's just not true. So I'm thankful that Olga Brown is there and kind of bringing her back into the present.
Yeah, great. You mentioned Remy and Rosa, who are also with you on stage, but also there's a third person. So actually in a way, we speak about your work as a solo, but actually you're very well accompanied on stage. So maybe you can introduce us to the other three people that share this work with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's like I've been sharing all the baggage, but the work has completely taken place in conversation. So with Raúl Cantizano, who's a guitarist, but also works with the guitarra preparada, which is his very unique rethinking of the flamenco guitar, and where he adds these sort of other objects to create other sounds. And he really is a pioneer in flamenco experimentation. He works a lot with Niño de Elche, who's now like the big singer of like, contemporary rupture in flamenco. And really, it's Raúl for many years who's been at the forefront of that musically. So it is a huge honor to have had him with me from the very beginning. I've come with all the things I've shared, but then we come into the studio when it was coming to kind of create the work. That has really been accompanied totally by Raúl Cantizano, Remy Graves, who's my sibling and who I felt like was necessary to have a reference in the work that wasn't only flamenco, because I think that opening, that aperture to other references, particularly that are rooted in, Afro-diasporic forms, was really important for me. And so Remy brings that, as well as also love. One of the things, so in me going back to values that exist in flamenco, I think community is one of them. That's not taught in the academy, that's not taught in class, but that is what is. That is what is when you see flamenco being performed. And so it was really important that not only Remy, who is my sibling, but that all of us also had like a human experience that had to do with love as well. And Rosa de Algeciras is totally that. Rosa de Algeciras is a beautiful singer. She has offered a lyric of the Romance, so she's written the lyrics to it, thinking through all of the things that the work explores from her own kind of perspective to a certain extent. And that to me is very generous. There are not very many flamenco artists who will write lyrics. Flamenco is very much to do with the repertoire. So it's been a really enriching experience, I think, for all of us to kind of see as well, because I think starting is I don't have a clue. I have these sensations, but what's going to happen? I had this idea that I wanted things to be states. I didn't want us to make. In fact, there's something that I cut out. Remy and Raúl made a beautiful track together. Let's say it's like a song, beautiful. But I was like, it's taking us into a world that actually I want things to be states. I want things to hold for like a long time and maybe aren't beautiful and comfortable and they're not harmonic in the same way. So that was clear for me, but how we'd make that happen was a whole other question. So we had residencies, and that's another thing that has been wonderful, is the support from different spaces. We started in Nottingham. In fact, the very first residency was in Seville at La Factoria, which is in Las 3000. Then we had a residency in Nottingham through Horizon Showcase. That was the first time we were able to come together with Remy. And then we finally were able to work to present something in the the Flamenco Festival in Nîmes the first time. And that's when Rosa came in. And it's just been like a building block and kind of coming back to it through those opportunities. So absolutely, it's one body dancing, but it's four bodies, four beings, four people communing and kind of creating that energetic space.
Yeah, and we can totally see this on stage because of like the energy and kind of the connections that you all have with each other. It's very astonishing. Even if you don't look immediately to each other, like say face to face, there's this kind of, 360 degrees awareness where one is what the other is doing and how things really resonate. Also because of the fact that you have live music and live singing, there's always this kind of walking side by side, right? There's also kind of this awareness and listening to each other, which is very special to see.
And so key in flamenco. Like that's what's so beautiful, I suppose, and moving about it is like the deep listening that it requires both internally and externally. I feel like flamenco has that power. It almost reminds us of what we need in its very, very way of existing.
Yeah, in the last talks that we have, you also mentioned, you just talk about your films that you did and also like you've been mentioning also some studies. Is there any other book or film reference that was also important to create this work that you want to share with us?
That's a good question. I think recently Fiasta Gates has been somebody that I've been looking at in this like multidisciplinary like interest in like, you know, I think through this work, this is my first solo piece, is also me understanding what matters to me. Why do I want to move? And understanding that maybe needing things to sort of fit comfortably into like this idea of choreography isn't necessarily it to a certain extent. People like, you know, Meira Goldberg's book, Sonidos Negros, that has been of great kind of influence in kind of shifting the space that we're thinking of in flamenco as well, after Miguel's film. Also, Nick Jones has a book called Habla de Negros, which is so wonderful because he brings us to the kind of Edad de Oro and like the big, you know, Lope de Vega, Cervantes, all the big Spanish writers, and kind of zooms in on the characters who were there that people forget of African descent, kind of again to speak to their presence and kind of gives them agency. And it's very interesting because he's kind of always questioning. And I suppose for me, this work is like, we know the situation. We know that people were enslaved. We know that that's a reality. We know we live in a society that finds it difficult to see us, but we know ourselves to be who we are as well. So I think, because recently I was asked about that, like, oh, the work is about invisibility. I'm like, yes, it's about life despite invisibility. It's like invisibility is the environment, but there's something else happening there. And for me, Nick Jones does that so well. It's like, in these words, we see this power that people are using in how they utter things, you know? And so that, I think, being able to converse, in fact, so not only works, but people, I have to mention Nora Chipalmire, who for me is like huge reference and a mentor. And I genuinely say, and I say this to her all the time, she saved me. She genuinely saved me because I think she saw me perform, I think maybe in 2018 or 19. And after she came and picked me up. And that I have struggled a lot in my flamenco journey because of this, just like doubting what I'm doing there and also just finding it difficult. But somebody who could see something beyond what you're usually meant to see was so important for me. And that I've studied with her. So her practice of Naka and also Dr. Amaray and her work of embodiology, which is really a kind of an improvisation form, are really what I've been nurturing myself with in terms of how to be in conversation with the history through my body. Let's say flamenco, maybe even though it's standing in it, hasn't been the way that I've excavated to come to that. And that has really been being in conversation with and studying with and sharing thought time and physical time with both Dr. Amaray and Nora Chipalmire, who've really helped me understand. And I think that's it. It's just having references that speak to, that make your experience make sense. And all the people that I mentioned have been doing that. And I'm sure there are many others in just the kind of the general sharing of information that's constantly happening.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us. I think we can slowly close the episode. Do you want to share something else with us, or if there's anything that you want to add?
I just want to thank you for your questions and for bringing everybody else into the space, because it's such a personal journey. I've been, centering on how I've done this, but I think my desire is to be beyond myself. And there's so many people who have helped all of this take place in a way. And so, no, I'm very happy for us to close here. And I'm really thankful for the invitation. For me, it's really huge to bring this work to Tanz in August. That's just incredible. So thank you. Thank you always.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.